She
Freshman on
did her street
I'm starting recording.
She did, when she got her bachelor's, she did like a bunch of field stuff, and that's how she got it.
So thank you, everyone. It's very nice to see you here. First of all, we have a special theme for the April seminar. So we have a couple of seminars that have special themes, and our April seminar, even though it's not Earth Day today, is usually an Earth Day-based event where we bring someone that is doing a pretty extraordinary work, either working on biodiversity issues or on conservation and restoration work, or a combination of those. So we're very excited to have Dr. Holly Jones today. Dr. Jones is originally from Iowa, and she did her undergraduate at the University of California at Santa Cruz, where she double majored in marine biology and in ecology and evolution. She then went on to get her PhD at the Yale School of the Environment, and she worked on island recovery after invasive mammal removal. From there, she went back to UC Santa Cruz and got her postdoc and worked on a couple of different things. She worked with a nature conservancy on global ecosystem recovery, and then she also worked with Conservation International, researching nature-based solutions to climate change. She's been a professor at NIU since 2012, and she's currently a professor with a joint appointment in biological and environmental studies. And I should say that she was just named presidential research professor, which is the highest rank you can achieve. So I think we should give a round of applause. We're very grateful and very fortunate to have you here today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. I hope you get a few deep breaths out. I appreciate it. It's wonderful to talk to you all today, and I appreciate the invite. My title's big and broad, because my science is often big and broad, but I'm mostly going to sort of tell high-level stories from my research with a little bit of mechanistic stuff tied in there. But yeah, thanks for having me. So I work on islands, and I think when I tell people I work on islands, most folks picture this, right? White sand beaches, maybe an umbrella drink in your hand. But I want to disabuse us all of that notion right now. The islands that I work on are wonderful and incredible, but they're also an assault to your senses. When you pull up in a boat, and especially on islands that don't have invasive mammals, the sky will turn dark with thousands of seabirds flying up into the air. Your nose is assaulted with the pungent smell of guano and rotting seaweed. And if you have the fortune of staying the night on one of these islands, you get treated to this cacophony. Right outside the test. Lovely. This is a combination, sorry, for those of you on Zoom, we couldn't figure out how to get you to be able to hear this. But it's a combination of about 7 different seabird species, breeding on some of those islands I work on in New Zealand. And at this point, you might be asking yourself, well, if it's not for the umbrella drinks and the white sand beaches, why do you work on islands? And the next picture really does a good job of answering that question. These are 23 different species, and they all have something in common. Does anyone know what they are? It is? Yeah.
Are they extinct?
They are. They were declared extinct by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service back in 2021. And this picture is really indicative of island species and their plight with extinction, because 11 of these 23 species are island species. And so I study biodiversity, and especially biodiversity that's imperiled. And if you study biodiversity that's imperiled, island biodiversity is especially imperiled. Essentially, over 60% of the extinctions that we've incurred and that species have incurred in the last 400 years have been island species. And so islands are an important component of species extinction, and that's part of the reason why I worked on them. And so Island biodiversity is incredibly rich, and biodiversity all over the planet is incredibly rich, right? Like biodiversity has evolved over hundreds of millions of years and provides us with a whole host of things we need, like food and water, medicine, beauty, spiritual connection. But unfortunately, we're losing biodiversity faster than we've ever lost it on Earth, including in the 5 mass extinctions like the ones that killed off the dinosaurs. And for me, when I see those 23 species that are gone forever, it's always made me really want to do something about it. And as a scientist, study about that and how we can reverse the biodiversity crisis. And so I'm not alone in this endeavor. A lot of people are looking at how we can stem this biodiversity loss. And generally, I sort of think of the two different categories of how to stem the biodiversity loss. And the first is the idea of preservation. This incredibly old map now is the first biodiversity hotspot research, where researchers sort of named these biodiversity hotspots, and they said if we protect these areas, we can protect most species on Earth. And the idea behind preservation or conservation is that we protect a certain area and then we let those species go about their business sort of undisturbed. Alternatively, restoration is concerned with how we restore damaged ecosystems. So this map is the global potential to restore forested ecosystems. And that's globally as big or bigger than the area of China. But you can imagine if this map showed the restoration potential of all ecosystems, the whole world, including the ocean, would just be alight in color, right? It underscores the fact that there's really nowhere on Earth that we haven't damaged. And so there's a lot of good potential to restore those ecosystems. And even in the context of biodiversity hotspots, restoration is important because to be included as a restoration hotspot, over 90% of your area has to have been impacted negatively somehow. So essentially these two approaches really go hand in hand. And my lab studies sort of both of them, but kind of on the restoration edge of the spectrum. So there are 3 sort of main thrusts in the lab that I'm going to try to cover briefly in this talk today. The first idea is asking how can ecosystem theory guide restoration efforts. So we've been doing ecosystem restoration for a while now, and we have a rich ecological theory that can be used to inform how we do restoration and what would most benefit from restoration. And that doesn't happen quite often enough, so that's one. And secondly is just what's happening with the biodiversity and functioning after we get rid of disturbances like oil spills and logging and a whole host of other things. And then I'm going to tell you sort of 2 different parts of the talk today. The first is going to be on island ecosystems, and the second is going to be on prairie ecosystems. And essentially this third thrust is my clever way of trying to create one umbrella under which all my research sits. So it's what role do ecosystem engineers play in ecosystem restoration and recovery? So on islands, ecosystem engineers are seabirds, and in prairies, it's the lovely bison. All right, so let's get to it. The first sort of part of the talk is about a global meta-analysis of ecosystem recovery that I initiated as part of a postdoc and then am continuing to build upon even this many years later. Quite a few years later. Okay, so this work was that postdoc, partially that postdoc that we talked about at the beginning that was funded by the Nature Conservancy, but has since grown into a sort of international collaboration with a bunch of folks who work in restoration and ecosystem, ecological economics, and a whole host of other folks. But essentially what we want to ask is how ecosystems are recovering after these large-scale disturbances, like agriculture, eutrophication. This is the dead zone off of the Gulf of Mexico underneath the Mississippi River. Logging, damming, oil spills, and mining. Okay, so what we did was did a literature search, and then we found 400 studies that looked at how ecosystems recovered from those big disturbances. And folks measured over 5,000 different ways that ecosystems were recovering. And I was interested in looking at 2 different metrics, and they're both related to resilience of communities. The first is response ratio, so that's essentially how complete is recovery relative to an undisturbed control. And the second is how fast are ecosystems recovering. We also noted whether ecosystems had been actively restored, so After the disturbance ended, humans were doing something. So after logging, maybe they were planting trees, versus just letting ecosystems recover on their own after we got rid of that disturbance. And people measured a whole lot of stuff. So this is a word cloud of just all the response variables that folks measured. And we tried our best to put those response variables into categories that made sense, but you can see abundance is one of the most commonly measured things, and you can see what else is measured here too. A lot of both biotic and abiotic types of things like ecosystem functioning, like carbon flux as well. Okay, so the overarching question for this work was, could ecosystems recover completely? That's that response ratio metric. And then does restoration help? And so before I populate this with data, I want to just walk you through it. This is for how complete recovery is, or the response ratio bit. And at 0 here, these dotted lines, if data overlap those, that means that variable had been completely recovered. And if they're negative, that means that they're not fully recovered. And if they're positive, they've gone beyond an undisturbed control. And then we're separating the same data out by disturbance type on the left and by ecosystem type on the right. And you'll see 2 bits of data. The first in red is for actively restored systems, and the second in blue is for systems that are passively recovering. And so here's what we found. The gray lines here are all the studies together. Here we have the number of response variables on the outside of the parentheses and the number of studies on the inside of the parentheses. Just gives you a sense of the weight of the data. And what you can see is that none of these lines on either side are overlapping 0. And what that indicates is that we do not have full recovery from disturbances globally. But what you should also be noting is the difference between the red and the blue arrows, and that's essentially, or red and the blue lines, that's essentially not a difference. And so what that means is that when we actively restore systems, that does not exact more complete recovery than just letting systems recover on their own. And I don't have enough time to show you the recovery rate data, but what I can tell you is that the recovery rates are all positive, meaning we are heading towards recovery. We just haven't met it completely. And that there's also no difference in recovery rate for actively restored versus passively recovering systems. So in other words, ecosystems are improving, but they're not completely recovering, and restoring actively doesn't help at this big, large global scale. I'm still a restoration ecologist. This doesn't mean restoration doesn't work, but it does mean a couple of things. It means, first of all, that conserving relatively undamaged systems continues to be an important and critical restoration/conservation goal. If we're interested in conserving biodiversity, it would be great if we stopped disturbing ecosystems and protected those that were relatively undisturbed. Ecosystem mitigation strategies like wetland mitigation banks, which are where a company here in the United States that wants to develop, if they're developing on a piece of land that has a wetland on it, our law says that they have to pay for a wetland to be put somewhere else, right? But our data suggests that ecosystems aren't fully recovering. So if we're putting a wetland somewhere else, that is not a one-to-one comparison. I just want to point out that restoration is still a baby as a science. And so we still need more information about what works where. So even though restoration didn't look better than passive recovery, in that data set are a lot of restorations that were doing a good job, but they just weren't necessarily doing a good job compared to just letting ecosystems recover on their own globally. So we have a little bit more work to do to figure out what works really well so that we can boost those restoration programs that are working well. And then we did team up with an economist, an environmental economist, and we calculated the amount of biodiversity and function that was lost in the intervening years as ecosystems recover. It turns out it's a lot, and so we should stop disturbing ecosystems if we can. So again, as I said, that was kind of an older project, just came out in sort of 2018, and what we're still working on building that database up a little bit more, and so amazing PhD student in my lab, Reg here, is expanding, sort of adding to my database with newer studies and building a bigger data set, essentially. And what she's interested in asking, which I'm really excited about, is who benefits from restoration? Specifically, which human communities benefit from restoration? So we know a lot about how ecological variables, respond to restoration, but we don't know a lot about how social variables respond to restoration. So she's going to look at human diversity metrics and ask which types of races and ethnicities are over or underrepresented in terms of benefiting from restoration projects. I'm really excited about that. And it's part of a collaboration we have going on with a couple of folks at the Chicago Botanic Garden. And we have launched the Black Earth Restoration Network and Collective. And so there's more about that here, but essentially it's a group of BIPOC scholars and white allies who are interested in getting other voices in the room beyond the typical folks who are generally in the room, which tend to be old and white and male-centric. And so, and the last slide, I'll have a QR code if anyone's interested in checking out this collective and in joining us. So we have a little survey for folks who want to join. And our hope is to get a group of folks sort of in this area who are interested in this stuff so we can talk and collaborate and knowledge share and just enjoy the joy of restoration. Okay, I'm going to move on to islands. And this is sort of more the how is biodiversity and functioning recovering after disturbances are removed. So again, a lot of folks participated in the research that I'm about to show you, including everyone listed here, and we have a wide variety of disciplines. I think you'll see this throughout my slides, essentially, and it's that conservation and restoration is a team sport. We have to work with a lot of different types of disciplines in order to make sure we're doing the best for species and communities and getting the best information. These are all just awesome island species. Love that. But really, the engines of this work and pretty much all the work I'm showing you today is driven by the amazing graduate students that I've had the opportunity to mentor and I'm still mentoring now. And so for the seabird work, these 6 lovely, wonderful, amazing graduate students are responsible for a lot of what I'm about to show you. All right, so invasive predators like cats and rats and stoats are a huge problem, and they've been introduced to over 90% of the world's islands. And that's resulted in some devastating impact to island ecosystems, including every single trophic level, plants and vertebrates, reptiles, land birds, and seabirds. And again, most species that have gone extinct in the last 400 years, they're island species, and those have been caused by invasive species. And maybe you're asking yourself, what's up with these island species? Why are they so vulnerable to extinction? And I think this sort of seabird picture blown up gives you maybe a little bit of an insight here. So this is the smallest species of invasive rat, the coyote or Pacific rat. It's about a 65-gram rat. And it's approaching the nest of a Laysan albatross, which is a 3-kilogram or so bird. And essentially, because this Laysan albatross has not evolved with predators, it has no evolved behavioral responses to predation, even by a rat that's tiny compared to its own body. And in fact, essentially over the span of a few nights, mice will chew completely through seabird skulls and necks and kill them completely. And they often consume eggs and chicks and a whole host of other things. And this predation leads to the decline of seabird populations and often extirpation and in some cases complete extinction. National Geographic has an amazing story which actually shows the picture of albatross heads having been chewed on by mice, but I decided to spare you. But if you're feeling a little macabre, feel free to Google that. I didn't want to put the trigger warning that I have to when I do that. So the predation upon seabirds on these islands is particularly important because they act as ecosystem engineers on islands. So true to their name, seabirds spend most of their lives in the open ocean, but they come ashore to nest, they're obligate land breeders, and when they do come to nest, they're colonial animals, so they often breed in numbers of up to the thousands or millions on a single island, and that has some pretty intense impacts on the island ecosystems which they choose to breed upon. So their burrowing creates some seed dispersal and some soil engineering. But perhaps most importantly for this talk, seabirds are flying fertilizer. They're top predators in the ocean. They feed in the ocean and they bring those rich marine-derived nutrients back to the islands on which they breed, which are often nutrient limited. So the islands on which seabirds breed are so unique that they have a term, and it's really original. seabird islands. And there's a whole book about them and their restoration and their recovery, which you can check out. But just to say, the islands that I'm working on are seabird islands, and they're unique in that way. All right, so mammals are bad. They're bad for island species, they're bad for extinctions, they're especially bad for seabirds, and that means a whole host of things for island ecosystem functioning. But I have good news, and it's that mammals can be removed. And so when I first started out in my career, I was noticing that we were getting rid of mammals on islands, but no one was really studying what happened after that. And so that's what I've been doing for most of my career, is asking, all right, we get rid of the mammals, then what happens? And so for the first bit, I'm going to show you sort of a global analysis where we asked how invasive mammal eradication had impacted native island animals. And so for this work, I teamed up with 29 of my closest island conservation colleagues and created a database of animal responses to invasive mammal removal. What we found are almost 800 populations of over 300 species on nearly 300 islands, which were documented to benefit from an invasive mammal removal, meaning their populations increased, they were reintroduced, they were translocated, they reappeared, they newly colonized or recolonized. And so that's the green dots here. Or they were predicted to benefit. And these are species we knew had experienced an eradication, an invasive mammal removal, but there wasn't necessarily anything in the literature that said that they benefited, and that's because islands are really hard to study and get to. So we predicted that they would benefit. So that's a whole lot of animals that were benefiting from invasive mammal eradication, and usually through population increases or something like that. But I just wanted to point out that not only are these species recovering, but some that we thought extinct or rediscovered after invasive mammals. Like this friend, the New Zealand storm petrel, one of the coolest birds ever. It's like pretty small, super cool. We thought it was extinct for over 100 years until we got rid of rats and cats from one of the islands I work on in New Zealand called Hoturu'utoi. And 10 years after cats and rats were removed, some of my collaborators saw this bird flying around this island, and it was the first sign of this bird in over 100 years. And since then, we've discovered that Hotaru is their only breeding site in the entire world, which is not good. And so we're working on moving some of them to other islands just in case something happens on Hotaru. But one of the coolest things in my career was when I got to help ban these birds on Hotaru'utoi. Y'all can ask me about it later because I can't go into the methods, but anyway. This is not the only species that was rediscovered. After we thought it was extinct, there were 3 more that were rediscovered too. But this one's obviously the coolest, but I'm not biased. Okay, so that was a global analysis, but a lot of the work that I've been doing is actually on multiple single islands, kind of looking at more mechanistic and in the field-based recovery. So let's get into that work a little bit. This work is in New Zealand, so this is the 2 islands of New Zealand, both in the Hauraki Gulf and also in Cook Strait. And essentially what I've done here is that since New Zealand created the technology to get rid of invasive mammals, they also have the longest history of time since invasive mammal removal. So if you're interested in looking at how islands recover over time, essentially what you can do is set up a natural experiment where islands are treatments in a natural history or in a natural experiment. And so in this case, we had 8 islands that had never been invaded, and so this is the idea of like a restoration goal. And then 14 had invasive mammals removed at different times ago, and then 5 were invaded, and that sort of acts as a positive control, sort of the disturbed state, if you will. All right, and then most of the islands that I worked on were pretty small, about 400 hectares or so, but we had one gigantic one in the data set, and it's actually the one I was just talking about where New Zealand storm petrels were rediscovered. This is Hoturu'utoi. It's a pretty large island. I think it's something like 20 times the size of UIUC's campus. It's 3,000 hectares. Pretty big. It even has a cloud forest up top. Okay, so before I jump into how the data essentially, I want to tell you that we use stable isotopes basically to track the influence of seabirds in these island ecosystems as a measure of recovery progress. And for those of you that aren't familiar with stable isotopes, I'm just going to give you a short primer here. So nitrogen on Earth comes in 2 stable forms, 15 nitrogen and 14 nitrogen. They differ only in their mass by 1 neutron. Marine food systems, because their food chains are longer, are dominated by 15 nitrogen. whereas terrestrial systems are dominated by 14 nitrogen. And what's cool about seabirds is they feed in the marine environment and they eat the things that are already enriched in 15 nitrogen, and then they fly to 14 nitrogen dominated islands and deposit those marine derived nutrients that are rich in 15 nitrogen in the island itself. And so if I take samples of soils and plants and anything up the trophic level, including up to carnivores on an island, and I measure the ratio of 15 nitrogen to 14 nitrogen, it can give me a sense of the influence that seabirds have on this island. And so that's what we do, which is a long way of saying, on the next slide, when I show you delta 15N, think lots and lots and lots of fairy prions. Okay, so that's what we did. We did take a bunch of measurements on these different islands with different times since eradication. And we looked at soils and plants and spiders, which are often the top predator on some of these islands because, again, they're pretty simplistic ecosystems with not top predators like mammals. And so on the y-axis, we have seabird influence. This is as measured by delta 15N. On the x-axis, we have time since eradication. So any dot you see is an island that's had a removal of invasive mammals. And then you're going to see a green line, which is the average, the average value for never invaded islands. So again, that's sort of the restoration goal. And then you're going to see a red line, which is the average value for invaded islands. And that's the point from which restoration begins. And so if we're recovering with time since eradication, we'd see a nice sort of line up. And yeah, indeed, that's what we see. So I have these separated out by really small islands, the red dots, and sort of medium-sized island, the green dots here. And what you can see is a nice sort of increase in recovery, even full recovery over here in soils, and perhaps pretty close for spiders with time since eradication, which is good news. So these islands are recovering, seabird influence is recovering. But I wanted to show animated Hotaru, the large islands data points, and that's here in the blue. And so what you can see here is that it's functioning as if it's invaded, despite the fact that it has some of the densest seabird colonies of all the eradicated islands. And I have a feeling this has to do with island size, and I have a National Geographic, I'm a National Geographic Explorer, and I have a National Geographic grant right now that basically is looking at a bunch of other larger islands with different times since eradication to see if this is just a weird one, or if there's sort of an island size threshold beyond which seabird islands aren't really seabird islands anymore. The nitrogen dynamics are basically being affected by something else. So stay tuned for that work. All right, so I've been talking mostly about terrestrial island, or all about terrestrial island ecosystems, but seabirds create what we like to call the circular seabird economy, where they feed in the marine ocean environment, they come back, they deposit a bunch of guano onto islands, but that guano then washes out into the ocean, right? Into that nearshore marine community. And obviously we have reason to suspect that islands that have different restoration or invasion mammal histories therefore might have different surrounding nearshore marine communities due to that guano washing into the water. And so that's what the next part of this work was looking at. And for this the two stars of this show are amazing PhD student Steph Burrell, who did the terrestrial work. So all these dots on these different islands are where she studied. And then Lindsay Rankin, who did the marine work. And so all these lines here are her transects in the marine environment. So for this study, we were looking at the Mercury Islands up here in the Iraqi Gulf. Here's a zoom in, another zoom in. And essentially, we have two islands that have never been invaded, and then an island that had rodents eradicated 30 years prior to the sampling, and then an island that had rodents eradicated 2 years ago at the time of sampling. So a pretty new eradication and an older eradication. The Kiwis are so good at removing invasive mammals, we didn't have an invaded treatment in the Mercury Islands in which to compare, so that's why that's not here. And so what we were interested in understanding is, to what extent are the terrestrial communities driving the composition of algae communities in the nearshore marine environment? So as Steph was measuring things like slope and aspect and soil delta 15N and seabird density on the land, Lindsay was underwater looking at which macroalgae species were there and in which combinations, okay? And so, again, before I populate this with data, I'm just gonna walk you through it. We have different drivers of macroalgae composition In the terrestrial realm, these are things like slope and aspect. For marine, these are things like depth and wave action. For season, it's pretty obvious whether it was rainy season or not. And then seabird density is the purple variable. And then this is sort of a random intercept of where the marine transects were. And on the y-axis, we have the proportion of variation that's explained by these different variables. And on the x-axis, we have different macroalgae species. Okay? So what we find is that for the newest eradication that had the least amount of time to recover, basically it's that the marine variable here, this sort of dark teal one, was mostly driving the variation in composition of the macroalgae species that you can see on the x-axis here. And again, this is things like, okay, so the macroalgae community composition is driven by depth or how much wave action there is. But let's see the rest of the data now. And what you can see is a sort of shift from a lot of marine variables driving the variation of macroalgae community composition to a lot of the terrestrial variables and seabirds driving macroalgae community composition. And so what that means is that there's a shift, right, in terms of what is driving the composition of macroalgae communities from something happening in the ocean to actually what's happening on land. And that's obviously probably driven by seabirds. I just wanted to, because this graph is like a lot, I wanted to just point out a single species so that you can sort of see that in case you feel overwhelmed by all the colors like I almost always do when I look at these graphs. So this is just one species, so you can see a lot of the marine community and then a lot, even more marine community in the old eradication. And what you see is that terrestrial communities and seabirds are driving the composition of this particular species in the uninvaded sites. Okay. So what's all this mean? Removing invasive mammals has been shown to be incredibly effective in conserving biodiversity, preventing extinctions, and even creating rediscoveries of species we thought were extinct. And that islands can recover their functioning, but it can take some time. So, it can take up to 15 years to first see recovery in seabird-driven nutrient dynamics, and that's just because these are long-lived species, and it takes a while for them to build up colonies. And we also need to really figure out the role that island size plays in terms of driving seabird island dynamics. And lastly, the linkages between seabird islands and the surrounding marine systems can recover after eradication, but again, the data suggests that it takes a little bit of time, right? Even those islands that were 30 years beyond eradication weren't looking just exactly like the never invaded islands. Should we talk about prairies? Let's do it. All right. So I started the job at NIU in 2012, and I worked on restoration of islands. And the islands I worked on were really far away. And I wanted to make sure I have some field sites, local field sites that I could take undergraduates to, that I wouldn't have to take them all the way down to New Zealand, and that would take forever. And so when you work on restoration and you move to Illinois, it turns out you study prairies. I would study prairies. And I had to learn all the prairies, because even though I grew up in Iowa, I didn't really know much about prairies. So I had to learn all the plants and the whole ecosystem. And it's been a lot of fun. It's kept me humble, which is great. But again, so these are the stars of the show here. I'm a generalist ecologist. I like to study everything. I'm interested in whole ecosystem recovery. So I'm not just interested in the inverts. I'm not just interested in the plants. I'm interested in it all. And so I've had the fortune of working with a lot of great students, and this is my longtime collaborator, who's not a student, Nick Barber, who have worked on different components, essentially, of the prairie ecosystem. So a lot of plant folk, a lot of small mammal folk, got some bird folk, herptiles, pollinators, other mammals, and invertebrates. So every one of these people have contributed significantly to the research that I do in the prairie ecosystems in which I work. Okay, so tallgrass prairie is the type of prairie that's in Illinois, and that was throughout much of the United States before we converted a lot of it into agriculture and development. So this map shows the historical extent of tallgrass prairie, which is in the lighter color, and then what's left is in the dark green. And Illinois is the prairie state, but we've lost 99.9% of our prairie, so much so that we don't even make the map in terms of what's remaining. And while that may be a bummer, there are a bunch of people who are working really hard to reverse that trend, including underneath this star at the place where I do most of my field work, Nachusa grasslands. It's in Franklin Grove, Illinois, which is about 45 minutes west of DePaul's campus, which means depending on traffic, it's anywhere from about an hour and a half to 2 hours west of here. It was founded by the Nature Conservancy in 1986, and every year since 1986, they've bought up plots of land to restore back from farm field to prairie. And now it's over 4,000 acres of restored and remnant or never plowed prairie, mixed in with some oak savanna and wetlands as well. And it's a pretty magical place to work, and I'm really fortunate. But so back in the 80s when the Nature Conservancy bought these properties, their goal was actually pretty revolutionary for the 80s. It was to connect the remnants that had never been plowed, and the remnants out at Nachusa are these rocky hill sites that had never been plowed because they were rocky. So the idea was to connect those remnants together with restored prairie in between to create gene flow for animal and plant communities and create a landscape, right, of habitat that would be important for plants and animals and other things. And for those of you who aren't familiar with how prairie restoration goes, essentially at Nachusa, they always start with a cornfield or a soybean field. And even if they buy a plot of land that hasn't been in ag for a while, they will put it in ag and rent it out to local farmers so that it can go through multiple cycles of Roundup application and reduce the weed seed bank. And in the fall, they're interested in restoring a site. What they will do is harvest the corn, and then they will harrow prairie seeds into the field. And so this is footage from our drone looking at the harrowing of these seeds. And so in a given planting, they'll plant anywhere from 150 to 200 native plant species, and the mixes are different depending on soil type. And then there's a lot more work to still be done, and you're not just done then, right? You just don't get prairie, it doesn't magically happen like that. There's a whole host of other things that have to be reinstated in order for prairies to be what they have always been. And so there are two particular historical disturbance regimes out there, and the first one is prescribed fire. So indigenous communities set fire to make it easier to live and work. And then in places that are being managed as prairies, if indigenous communities aren't there anymore, then managers will use prescribed fire. And prescribed fire can be really important because it decreases invasive species because they're often intolerant to fire, but prairies have evolved with fire, so they do pretty well. But the other sort of side of this prescribed fire coin is that grasses really do well after fire. And grasses are great. I mean, it's prairie, right? It's tallgrass prairie, it's the name. But they're also competitively dominant over the wildflowers. And so when you burn a lot like this, what ends up happening is grasses start to dominate and it reduces plant diversity, which is counter to many managers' goals. And to deal with that, a lot of managers will reintroduce the second historical disturbance regime, and that's of grazing by these mega herbivores, bison. So bison are essentially gigantic lawnmowers. They particularly like to eat those grasses that become competitively dominant. So that's part of the reason why they're reintroduced out there, is to sort of balance out the biodiversity. They're also an amazing conservation success story. We almost drove them to extinction back in the late 1800s. This is a photo of a man standing on a mountain of bison skulls and a man at the bottom of said mountain. And this was state-sanctioned removal of bison in order to force the tribal communities to take land treaties and a whole host of other things that were against their best interests. But some conservationists saw the problem and got bison into some captivity, and they've since been reintroduced into the OS. And at Nachusa grasslands, they reintroduced a herd of bison in 2014, and there are now anywhere from 100 to 120 bison out on the landscape. And it was the first time bison were reintroduced back to the tallgrass prairie region east of the Mississippi River at the time. Pretty cool. So again, bison are ecosystem engineers on prairies. Not only do they eat those grasses and give the competitive advantages back to forbs, but they create these gigantic wallows, and that's where they lay down and sort of itch themselves, and this is also a social thing, and they release some hormones and stuff, and that creates like huge patches of just denuded vegetation, and they create ephemeral ponds in the spring, so there's like this patch of land that's sort of sitting low, and so in a lot of the upland prairies I worked in before bison were reintroduced here, now there's frogs singing from these ephemeral ponds in the spring, which is really cool, and it's great habitat for like native birds, native nesting bees, so pollinators like bare ground habitat. But they also just create this mosaic, essentially, of tall and short, highly grazed and ungrazed grasses, and that's because they are a little picky, essentially. They choose to eat grasses, but they love a grass that's just recently been burned, and that's because those grasses actually have a little bit more nitrogen, so it gives them more protein, essentially. And so they don't graze evenly throughout the landscape. Instead, when they're on the landscape, they create this heterogeneous ecosystem, which is really good for a lot of biodiversity. So when I found out they were going to reintroduce bison, in 2 years, I just basically called up everybody I knew who could study anything having to do with ecosystems out there, and we started to ferociously gather before data. We didn't know a whole lot about how bison reintroduction would impact restored plant communities. A lot of what we know about bison impacts on prairies is in these remnant, never plowed, never restored ecosystems. But this was a unique one in that we were reintroducing bison in the middle of restorations that have different ages. So old restorations, young restorations, and mid-age restoration. And so my lab has a long-term both small mammal research program and then plant research program where we trap small mammals 3 times a year, and we see what's there, and we tag them, and we look at a whole host of things about their life and survival. And then we also have 190 different plots where we look at the plant communities every year, which species are there, and what abundances. I have collaborators who worked on pollinators. My close collaborator works on both dung and ground beetles. I've had a bunch of graduate students who've been interested in the bird communities out there, and then collaborators working on soil microbes as well. So this is a map of Natusa grassland. So it's again up here in Franklin Grove, Illinois. This was taken, this map took forever to make. It was actually from drone footage, so that's why I put it up here, even if you don't think it's cool, like it took forever for us to actually stitch all these stupid pictures together, so you're getting it regardless. But essentially what they've done is they reintroduced bison only in half the acreage out there. So they've created their own natural experiment, where half the acreage is in the bison unit getting grazed, and half the acreage is outside the bison unit, as indicated here in the green. And again, they restore plots of land every single year, and so we have a chronosequence of time since these prairies were restored in both the bison unit and outside the bison unit. I essentially call this place a restoration ecologist playground because they've essentially set up the perfect experiment if we want to ask things about how these systems recover. And prescribed fire is set to the land according to what the land managers think. So I have no say in what happens with the burning, except for asking them to please stop burning my science, which they've only done once. We have a ton of different science out there on like what's happened into the prairie communities. I do not have time to take you through it all, so I'm just going to take you through sort of one of the cool papers, and then I'll walk through just really quickly some other stuff that we've looked at. So for this particular study, we wanted to ask if animal biodiversity was more strongly shaped by the plant community or by the active management that was happening out there. There's essentially this idea in restoration, it's called the field of dreams hypothesis, which no one understands anymore because no one has seen the movie. Raise your hand if you've seen Field of Dreams. Yep, that's right, it's about half. Anyways, this movie is a cornfield, whatever. They build a baseball stadium so that shoeless Joe Jackson could play baseball again. But anyway, it's called the Field of Dreams, and in it, there's this like creepy, ghostly voice that says, if you build it, he will come. And the idea in restoration is if you build it, they will come. If you build a plant community, the rest of the animal community will follow. And it's, it's a highly touted hypothesis in restoration, and managers pretty much go by this. They're like, if I just do these plants, the animals will come, right? Like that's just kind of what the dogma is in the field. And so for this study, we had, again, like we had so much data because we were trying to get as much as we could. So we had multiple measures of animal biodiversity in terms of taxonomic and phylogenetic diversity. And then for plants, we had different types of diversity. So taxonomic, and that's species richness. We had phylogenetic diversity, so how close are they related on the evolutionary tree. And then we had functional diversity, so what's the mix of sort of tall and short and C3 and C4 and all that sort of stuff. And then we also had management actions. So in the field of dreams hypothesis, the idea is, okay, management builds plants, and then plant diversity begets animal diversity. But we had another direct sort of line we were testing, which is, does management actually directly affect the animal communities, not through plant biodiversity? And so one cool statistical way to ask this question is called structural equation modeling, which allows us to say, is this link supported? is this link supported and to what extent, essentially. And so I wanted to tell you about which animal communities we are talking. So we have 4 years of plant surveys that went into this data, also 4 years of small mammal data. My colleague Rich King is a herp guy, and so he has 1 year of coverboard data in here for snakes. And then other colleague, Nick Barber, looks at dung beetle and ground beetle community. This is a really high, really fancy dung beetle trap. It's really high tech. It's a solo cup that's on the ground. It's got some antifreeze down here and some poop on top. Yep. 2 years of invert data. And essentially in total, we have 278 species and 5 distinct communities that went into building the structural equation models that I'm not going to show you because they're a pain in the butt. So, because they're just a lot, but if I can show them to you afterwards if you're really interested. But really the question was not about the SEMs themselves. It was more, is animal biodiversity driven more by management actions or by plant actions? And if the field of dreams hypothesis is supported, we should see a really high effect magnitude in the plant-driven links versus the management-driven links. Alas, we do not. In fact, management-driven efforts were 6 times stronger than plant-driven impacts on animal biodiversity. And what this suggests to us is that maybe we should give, management and not just plants a little more credit. Essentially, management's doing a lot directly to the animal communities, and it's often an underappreciated link out there. So, no Field of Dreams. So you don't need to see the movie, it's fine. Okay, so in short, essentially management can have really strong impacts on these animal communities. Look how cute this mouse is. Oh my gosh, it's so adorable. And you have to consider synergies and conflicts. So it's, those different animal communities were affected differently by management. Fire can be really good for this species, the deer mouse. It loves fire, but its cousin, the vole, hates it, right? And so there are these trade-offs, right, if you're doing a particular type of management action. And so this type of information is important, but it kind of makes managers' jobs a little bit harder, frankly. Okay, so this is my 11 years of work all in one slide of the rest of the stuff we've done out there. It's not everything, but I'm trying. So we did a study on bison diet, and we found that their diet shifts seasonally. They rely a lot on sedges in the winter. And they actually, 30% of their diet is not grass. It's legumes and forbs, which was unknown before we did that work. For the dung beetle community, we see higher dung decomposition in the bison unit and higher abundance and richness of dung beetles themselves. And for bird communities, we had an increase in nesting success 2 years post-bison restoration, and then since then it's kind of evened out in terms of even nesting success both in and outside the bison unit. But we do see a change in the bird composition as bison are reintroduced. And for the small mammal communities, what we find is that they actually change their behavior in the presence of bison. So small mammals are nocturnal. They try to avoid predators like owls that are visual predators by not coming out on nights of high moonlight, right? Because they can be seen pretty easily. But in a tall grass prairie, the grass protects them. So they actually don't care about moonlight a whole lot. So their activity doesn't change if the moon is bright or if it isn't, because their predation risk isn't changed because that grass helps protect them. But in the bison unit, bison eat those grasses. And so bison unit mammals do not come out in full moonlight nights. Instead, they wait and come out, or they come out before moon rise or after moon set. So they actually change their behavior according to what the bison are doing to the plants, which is pretty cool. Okay, the last thing I'm going to tell you about, how fast am I talking? We should be good. I want to tell you about is an experiment that I have that's on NIU's campus that we lovingly refer to as CAPER. It's the Community Assembly and Prairie Ecosystem Restoration. And it's essentially a biodiversity and ecosystem functioning experiment. So many of you will probably have seen the graphs where if I increase the number of species on the x-axis, my ecosystem function increases on the y-axis. And so those are lovingly known as biodiversity ecosystem function experiments. But a lot of those experiments, which we sort of think that apply to the real world, those studies are often framed about the biodiversity crisis. And so they're framed as if their implications matter for actual real ecosystems. But the experiments themselves are often very unrealistic. Our 3 species communities might be 3 species that have never been in combination with each other. Our 16 species communities, again, may not even happen in nature. And so we're leaving a lot to an unrealistic set of experiments in terms of inferring what we should do to manage biodiversity. And so for this experiment, what we did was we took the plant data that we've had for 10 years, and we used that to set up a biodiversity and ecosystem functioning experiment that has realistic assemblages of plant communities realistic to Nachusa grasslands. So essentially, we wanted to look at what happens to ecosystem functioning, and the functions are decomposition, biomass, and nitrogen uptake. When we change functional diversity of plant communities, and this is again like how many species are tall versus short, those that have thick and tough leaves versus thinner and not so thin leaves, those are different plant traits that go into functional diversity. And then what happens when we change the number of species as well? So we essentially have a factorial cross design where we're changing both species richness and functional diversity. And so we've started out with an initial community of 12 species that are taken from a pool of the 24 most common species out at Nachusa grasslands. And then we're essentially putting communities together in mathematical space so that we have communities that have the same level, essentially, of functional diversity, but change the species richness, that have less functional diversity than the initial community, and either remain the same or change species richness, and then the same thing up here. And again, so each one of the communities that we have in this experiment is a combination of plants that we do see out there in nature and that represents either high or low functional diversity in real communities. And so we do that, we have 3 different initial communities. There's us. 4 replicates of that, and that yields 156 experimental plots that are 1.5 meters by 1.5 meters with 48 plants in each. It was a lot of plants, a lot of planting. And I don't have any data to show you, but instead I have a GIF of my babies growing. We collected the first round of data last year and we're frantically analyzing it. And I just wanted to show you the bigger plants. So that was like the first year, the GIF was the first year. And also shout out to my dog Polar. But anyway, the plants are a lot taller now and these are big plant communities. So I'm really excited to answer some questions about these communities that are as realistic as we can get them. And we're also fake bison grazing according to the proportion of bison diet that we know exists out there to have the plots. So adding in a trophic interaction. So I'm excited about that. Okay, last slide, I promise. A lot of people ask me, do you think we can restore damaged ecosystems? Like, is there any hope out there? And I have to say, when I pull up to Nachusa and I see this mammal we almost drove to extinction sort of out there grazing, and it's one of the few places in Illinois where you can sit in the middle of it and look 360 degrees and see all prairie, everything what it used to look like. I can't help but think, yeah, absolutely. And I think all of these different bird species that have recolonized islands after invasive mammals were removed are also indicative of the fact that, yeah, we can restore damaged ecosystems. So this is, ecosystem restoration or restoration ecology is at its heart a science that's based in hope. With that, I will thank again the engines of this research, which are my amazing lab team. I also want to say, if you do research similarly that matters, it's about management or managing of ecosystems, I'm the lead editor of a relatively new journal called Ecological Solutions and Evidence, and we're interested in publishing management relevant science and science by managers, so check it out. And if you're interested more about the Black Earth Restoration Collective, it's here, and I want to thank you for your time as well.
We have some time for questions.
Yeah.
How are mammals removed from islands? I can imagine you leave one pregnant female and everything's gone. So how do you do that?
Yeah, great question. And it's how do we get rid of mammals on islands? One pregnant female and that's it. It's a failure, essentially. It's hard and it depends on the species. For rodents, if the island is pretty topographically complex, which they almost always are, we essentially drop rodenticide, which is a rodent poison, from helicopters with differential GPS to ensure essentially that every single rat's territory essentially has bait in it. It often takes multiple applications for species like mice, which are a little bit more cryptic and harder to get into every single one of their territories. But essentially, and then it's like 2 years of hard work of just trying to go out there and get zeros of these animals. And not until you've got 2 years of zeros can you declare something eradicated. So for things like cats, it's trapping. And then the last few smart ones often have to be hunted. And then it just varies otherwise. So grazers can actually be herded often off onto a boat if we want to just move them somewhere else or give them out as meat. But they sometimes are also shot from helicopters, just depending on who's doing the removal. So it is a lot of work. These are multi-million-dollar efforts. But again, like then species reappear that we thought were extinct. So it tends to be worth it.
How do you prevent recolonization by mammals?
Yeah, it's so hard to prevent recolonization by mammals. So this, if you want to look it up, it's called biosecurity. And so it's very intense on islands where we spent millions of dollars to get rid of them. So on one island, Anacapa Island that I worked on, that's part of the Channel Islands off of California, essentially after we got rid of the rats there, every single boat that ever lands has to have a biosecurity permit where they have traps on their boats and they have poison on their boats. And then the islands, anywhere where you can land with a boat, has traps and bait out just in case. And then every single year they go around and they do surveys to make sure that there hasn't been an incursion. And often if you catch an incursion early, then you can get rid of them pretty quickly before their populations have had chances to expand. So it's called biosecurity. There's a lot of work on it out there. Yeah.
How do you secure funding for a project this big?
Yeah, are you asking like for the mammal removals or for like my science? Those are two. For my science, it's hard. I write a lot of grants and I'm tired. So this science is harder to fund than basic science because basically in the US, most of our science funding, if you work in my field, comes from the National Science Foundation. And I have NSF funding for that last experiment that I talked to you about, and then some of the NACHUSA work as well. But it's harder, essentially, to write grants like that because they don't care if your work is applied at all. So I can't write and say, I want to tell managers like which plants they should plant. Like NSF would laugh me off the stage. So instead, I have to like root myself in ecological theory and ask questions that can be asked that you can basically use restorations to ask. So it's hard and harder than just someone who's doing kind of basic science techniques. But because this stuff is applied, then I have a lot of other funders that I can pull from. So I'm a National Geographic explorer. National Geographic Society funds a lot of the island work. The local councils in New Zealand often will fund our stuff, like Auckland Council has funded a lot of our work because they're really interested in making sure that their lands are managed in the right way. So that just means I can pull from different funding sources. But when it comes to like bigger federal grants, those are a little bit harder for applied work folks so you just get good at like thinking about theory and thinking about questions you can ask to advance theory, but uniquely ask in a restoration setting.
Just curious because you mentioned using techniques that Native American communities have used to restore prairie lands.
Yeah.
Have you tried to involve them in your restoration efforts?
Yeah, so NACHUSA Grasslands has a really special connection with a couple of different tribal nations. And they have a really strong connection with what's called the Intertribal Buffalo Council specifically, which is a group of a variety of indigenous nations. And essentially, they want to maintain the grazing at about 100 head of bison. So every fall, they have a roundup to give vaccinations and count the bison. And they give any extra bison to the Intertribal Buffalo Council. And those tribes are reintroducing bison back to their ancestral lands and returning that cultural connection. I've had the opportunity to go up to the Menominee tribe in Wisconsin to one of the bison coming home there, and it was one of the coolest experiences of my life. And I have a connection with the Menominee Nation specifically where I've told them, like, you know, if anyone's interested in coming to get sort of a Western science degree, but asking questions about which of these plants are food plants and medicine plants, like it'd be so cool to do that. But I would, if I was advising, it'd need to be through a Western science perspective. Obviously, I'm a white marine scientist. So yeah, I'm hoping that eventually we'll get even a stronger connection there. But yeah, these Nachusa has really strong ties with tribal communities, and Chicago has the densest population of non-reservation indigenous people here, and so there's strong connections there. Like when we did this like really big dinner with a few different tribal nations, we're out at Nachusa, including a few from the Chicago area too. Yeah.
You mentioned briefly, and I also saw the Pix4D logo on
Yeah.
there, that you did some drone work. So I was just curious, did you just do it for like mapping the sites, or have you used it for?
No, yeah, we've done the science. I just couldn't put it all in there, right? So a master's student in my lab, Ryan Blackburn, published something in 2021, and it was about if we could use drone imagery to quantify biodiversity in prairies. Drone imagery is pretty good, and like, he also looked at, could we get like functional trait information from drone imagery? And the short of it is, our drone is too cheap to actually do that well. Multispectral imagery is what's necessary to get that kind of information, but even with multispectral imagery, it's really hard in a heterogeneous prairie to get the proper information. But he did actually come up with one of the, it wasn't NDVI, but you know how there's like SDVI and 1,000 other things. So one of those things, and it was, I think, the variation in that thing was the best predictor of biodiversity, but it still had an R-squared of like 45. It's all right. Anyway, we still have the drone, and we are interested in looking at how fire catches in different ways out there, because now that bison are cruising around, there's certain areas that don't take as well when we burn, and drone imagery is great for green up. So I have another student who's working on that too.
It's a different kind of question, but students get involved in your research at some point hit the realization that to clear an island, how do you handle that transition from I want to get involved in this because I want to do good and I want to save and everything else, and then inside that discussion is a bunch of animals going to die to do these things?
It is hard. The worst days of my career have been after bait drops on islands. Like, rats are smart, and I don't like to kill them. It sucks, frankly. And it doesn't sit well with me. My whole goal is like try to preserve biodiversity, right? But I mean, the data don't lie, right? Like, can I stomach that thing for a few days and just know that the rats are doing okay in the world, right? But Scripps' murrelets almost went extinct before we got rid of those rats on Anacapa. Now they're not even on the endangered species list anymore. So it's tough. There are ethicists who talk about how we shouldn't kill anything at all, right? But that's a choice. That also is a choice, and it's a choice to doom species to extinction. And so for me, it's a pretty clear, like, which way it weighs, but it's not easy. And
Well, for you, sure, but then the training a student, when a student joins your lab,
yeah.
and they're like, hey, this is what I want, and I've been through this, right?
Yeah.
Here's what I want to do. Okay, that's
Yeah.
great. And let me tell you some things you have to think about in this world, right?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I just have an empathetic conversation with students, right? And I sit down, and even with the small mammal project, like, we're just looking at small mammal communities, but sometimes they die in our traps. Not very often, but sometimes. And again, the worst days, right? Like, you don't want your animals to die. Even on the islands where we're actually trying to kill the animals, that sucks. You just have conversations about whether it's for that student or not. And sometimes it's not, but it turns out there's tons of other stuff you can do in science. You can analyze the data or whatever, right? And so I just sit down and have like empathetic
So there is some
conversations.
nutrition, there's some kind of a want to, but now you've told me everything, maybe it's not.
Maybe that's not for me. And maybe I just analyze the 10 years of data that's sitting over here, and that's fine too. Yeah. And I've had plenty of people who were like, nope, small mammal work's not for me. Like, the few animals that die, I just can't handle it. And I feel that's my core. It's the worst. I hate it.
Do you have, I know you work with managers specifically at the Nachusa Prairie.
Yeah.
Hopefully I said that correctly. But how would you characterize your relationship with students that realize maybe they don't want to do the research part of it and they want to do the management part of it? What does that pipeline look like?
Yeah, I have a ton of students who go on into management, right? Like, and I teach a restoration ecology class, and half of it's like us talking, doing sort of reading of the literature, but half of it's them getting in groups and doing their own restoration projects on campus. So they're actually getting their hands dirty. I offer a prescribed fire certification, a 1-credit class where they can get their type 2 firefighter. So a lot of students, if they just want to do hands-on restoration, they can be done after undergrad. But I also get a ton of students coming through grad school, they're not interested in academia. Most of them aren't, frankly, which is probably a good thing because academia is kind of a mess. But we need more managers out there. And so I just talk to them. I'm like, hey, what do you want to do for your career? And we have this conversation every year because sometimes it changes. And if they're interested in management, I hook them up with those managers. And I'm like, you should hang out with Bill and Cody for a little while, see what it is they do, and you should pick a project that's really management oriented. And we don't have to worry so much about getting you published in the highest journal ever or getting you grant funding because that doesn't matter for your career. And so I really tailor my advising style according to what students want to do. I have plenty of people who want to go into academics. We do that thing too. But that's what I do. I just make sure that we have conversations early and often about what they want to do and make sure they're hooked up accordingly.
And then I do have like a little bit of a
Yeah.
follow-up question. Have you done any research, or is there any like paleo-ecological data that you've looked at that has like helped you in your like further your own research?
I am always interested in paleo data. It is so hard to look at the graphs of just like, this is all the pollen for 2,000 years, and it hurts my brain just a little bit, I have to say. But like, most restoration ecologists use a variety of backward-looking and forward-looking ideas for like what restoration should look like. So I'm a little bit familiar with the paleoecology literature, but frankly, we're doing a lot less backward-looking and a lot more forward-looking in restoration because we're dealing with climates we haven't seen before and a whole host of other things, which means we often want to restore to the future rather than to the past. But you don't want to get rid of it, right?
Thank you.
Can I squeeze in one more?
One more
Sorry.
question.
Sorry.
Yeah.
So you mentioned a dogma
Yeah.
existing that you address, and people dig in
Yeah,
on those.
absolutely.
So I wondered how was that, what was the response? To saying, you know, there's this, but then there's this.
You know what? Because of the way we framed it, managers their hackles were not raised. What they thought was, yeah, we impact everything. And they felt pretty good about it, you know? And I work directly with managers and I make sure like, I'm not trying to produce science that's gonna like call them out in any way or isn't gonna be useful to them. Like we work closely hand in hand. And so they weren't fussed. But to get it into sort of a high academic journal, you kind of have to do this dichotomy. Well, is it plant driven or is it management driven? But when it all comes down to it, so managers there's a grassland restoration network where managers will connect with each other and sort of talk about science. And so they talked about this one, and it was mostly like patting each other on the back. It was really funny, which is fair. They do cool stuff.
Okay, with that, we should probably end it just because of the time. Thank you very much for a great talk.